Okay, this is a revision video on an inspector calls. Just before I start, I should point out that this video is meant to cater for both the foundation and higher papers, so inevitably I have to sort of pitch it at somewhere in the middle. So I think it's certainly got enough, if not more than enough, information for kind of C grade work, and certainly enough for B grade as well. If you're looking to get a bit higher than that, then this might be a starting point for you to look at the play in a bit more detail and develop some of your own ideas. But if you have any questions about how much depth you need to know the play in, please just speak to myself or your English teacher. Okay, so just to remind you, this Inspector Calls is part of your second literature paper, and you have two questions here. The first part is on Inspector Calls, the second part of the paper is on heroes. Now, this is important to note. So you have an extract and an essay response, as is the case for all of your literature texts. However, like of Mice and Men, you get assessed on different things in the different parts of the question. Okay, so you're assessed on AO1 for both parts of the question, which is the main AO, so your critical response to the text. Can you talk about characters and themes in a thoughtful way? Can you select details from the text, and ideally quotations, especially if you're aiming for sort of B grade or higher? And can you comment on and evaluate these quotations? AO2, can you comment on language structure and form? So this is important only for the extract response. What kind of language is being used? And also, because this is a play, you can analyse dramatic techniques, so the stage directions, the way people speak, who interrupts whom, and that kind of thing. What's really important for the essay response, and you're only assessed on it here, so don't talk about it in the extract response, but for the essay response you're assessed on AO4, which is context, okay, historical, social, cultural context. So you don't need to analyse language for this, but you do need to make links to the context of the play. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about context AO4, because that's the most useful way to start thinking about the play, I think. As you should know, it's an interesting play because although it was written and first performed in 1945, the play is actually set in 1912. So these are two very distinct historical periods. One is at the end of World War II, 1945, then 1912 is when the world was on the brink of World War I. So World War I broke out in 1914. And you'll remember that at the beginning, Mr. Burling talks about the Titanic is about to set sail, so we know it's 1912. One of the huge distinctions between these two periods is in terms of social class. In 1912, there was a huge division between the upper and lower classes. You could see even by that picture I've included of Downton Abbey, people from the different classes didn't mix. Okay, if you're born into the upper class, that's kind of where you lived your life. You wouldn't speak to someone who was working class unless they worked for you. However, after two world wars, where in which suddenly men from working class backgrounds and upper class backgrounds had to fight for their country together, and they were in the trenches together in World War One. At home, everyone was experiencing rations. In World War Two, there would have been air raids and other things that affected everyone. There was no room for people to be divided by class. Everyone was kind of in it together. And as a result, there was huge social levelling, and people realised how kind of artificial it was to divide people by class. However, the Burling family, as you know, are very much representative of 1912 attitudes. They're very bound by their class. Another important part of the context is the relationship between workers and bosses. So unlike today, there was very little protection for workers, very little job security. So workers had very little legal rights to protect themselves from being fired. There was no welfare system, no benefits, no NHS. There was nothing to protect the sort of more vulnerable people in society or poorer people in society if they didn't have a job. They were completely at the mercy of their bosses. There were no trade unions to protect working class people if they'd been mistreated, and to advocate the rights of workers. And I think the first ever miners' strike in the UK was in 1912. So it was a very new thing to try and stick up for your rights as a worker. And obviously this has clear implications for Eva Smith. She does try and stand up for her rights as a worker and tries to challenge the poor wage that she gets as a worker. However, Mr. Burling wants to keep labour costs down because, of course, that makes him very competitive, or his company very competitive, and means he can generate the most profit. But as you see in the play, Eva Smith obviously had very little power or influence to change that, and actually, by trying to do so, she got fired. So she was in a very vulnerable position, like many workers were, both men and women in those days. Another important context or contextual factor is gender. So in 1912, women were entirely or very much subservient to men. So if you were a well-off woman, so middle class or upper class, your goal in life was to get married, to make a good match, which is what we see with Sheila initially. By marrying Gerald, she would secure her family a link with the Croft family, who are a very well-established family with great business prospects. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were a poor woman, you would have been seen as cheap labour, and many unmarried mothers were driven into prostitution. So very limited opportunities available to women in 1912. It was quite a difficult position to be in, even if you were in a wealthy family. However, in 1945, England had just seen 2 world wars, and particularly in the Second World War, when the men were all fighting on the front, women were needed to step up and fill in their roles at home, on the home front, and work in factories and so on and so forth. So, although there certainly wasn't absolute gender equality in 1945, there was still a long way to go. Women had a much more valued place in society. And I suppose this is the most important thing when thinking about the context. why did Priestley set his play in 1912 when he wrote it in 1945? So I think what we really need to think about here is what kind of message is Priestley trying to give us, and also give his audience in 1945, by using these two time periods? Well, I think the answer to this is he wanted to remind this post-war nation in 1945 and say, look, this is where we were over 30 years ago in 1912. This is what England looked like, and look how unfair and divided our society was. Look how we treated working class people. Look at the attitudes and prejudices upper class people had towards them. Look at how unfair society was in terms of, income and opportunities, depending on your background and your gender. So I think it's a reminder to people of how far the country has come, but also a warning. Let's not go back there. We've made all this progress, but we've still got a long way to go. Let's not regress and go backwards. Okay, so I'm now going to talk through each of the characters in the play, because, of course, one of the essay questions is usually on a character or relationships between characters. So Mr. Burling is head of the household, and he's the character that's focused on at the opening of the play. And we notice right from the outset, right from the beginning, that he has a real sense of self-importance. And if you notice, if you reread Act 1, he speaks the most in this scene. And, he gives his big speech about sort of congratulating his daughter Sheila on her engagement to Gerald, and deliberately cuts off other people from speaking, but it shows how he thinks he's in control of what's going on in his family. In that speech, however, he's shown to be arrogant, and actually not only arrogant, so not only quite cocky, but rather ignorant. And he's made to look this way by Priestley's use of dramatic irony. So you might want to use this term if you've covered it in lessons. It's certainly not necessary, but it's a very useful term. So remember, dramatic irony means the audience knows something that the characters on stage do not. And in this case, Mr. Burling talks about how he thinks war's never going to happen. He says, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable, and to that I say fiddlesticks. Equally, he goes on to talk about the Titanic, which was this sort of remarkable ship which everyone was talking about, and he says unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Now, we as a modern audience, and also the 1945 audience, would have known that a war did break out, and it was of an unprecedented scale. Never before had the world seen such a war. Went on for 4 years. Not only that, that the Titanic sunk, and that the people who supposedly thought they were experts on it, that it was unsinkable, were entirely wrong. So it's quite significant that Priestley has done this. He's really trying to undermine Mr. Burling's attitude here and outlook on life. And perhaps could we take it even further and say the Titanic is a ship which is a kind of symbol of Britain's industrial success. Mr. Burling's an industrialist. He has a big successful factory. The fact that that sinks could that be a warning that Mr. Burling's going to, suffer a similar fate? Is he going to sink or decline later in the play? Also, if he's wrong about this, perhaps he's going to be wrong about other things. Perhaps he doesn't see things very clearly. Leading on from that, you might say that Mr. Burling has a capitalist outlook on society. Now again, if you haven't used this word in lessons, don't worry, I will just move straight on. But if you have, you'll remember that it means it's an idea that the economy and should allow for all individuals to make as much profit as possible. So it's very much focused on the individual, so just focusing on yourself, trying to make as much money as possible. Now, obviously in this kind of society, and we live in a capitalist society nowadays, there are winners, but there have to be losers. So some people become extremely wealthy, and some people don't, and some people suffer. So if you noticed in that picture on the PowerPoint or the keynote, capitalism produces a very unequal society. But that's what Mr. Burling believes in, because he's very selfish. If you notice that quote, if we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? So that's a comment he makes after he hears about Eva Smith's death. He cannot fathom that he is somehow responsible for her, because he's so focused on his own individual success, and his selfishness is also shown throughout the play when his priority is protecting himself, his company, Burling & Co., his family and his reputation. He'd much rather do that than acknowledge the fact that he might be somehow guilty and involved in Eva Smith's death. Finally, he's a very stubborn character, and he hasn't changed at all by the end of the play, and he kind of rejoices when he finds out the inspector wasn't real. Okay, Mr. Burling's married to Sybil Burling, or Mrs. Burling, and she has, maybe even more so than Mr. Burling, a real sense of superiority, which means she thinks she's better than people. Entitlement, which means because of her social class, she feels that she's allowed to treat people a certain way. She thinks there are certain rules that apply to her or don't apply to her that apply to others, and she's very prejudiced. She has very clear ideas about people from other backgrounds, which are probably unfair. And you'll notice throughout the play that she makes quite snobbish remarks, especially about Eva, and she says things like "girls from that class" throughout the play. So she makes all these judgments about Eva, despite never having met her, and just basing them purely on the fact that Eva was working class. Now, it's important to note that Mrs. Burling she's the social superior of her husband. So while Mr. Burling comes from a kind of more modest background, and he worked his way up to become very successful, so he's kind of middle class, he's a businessman, Mrs. Burling comes from a kind of upper class aristocratic background. So her family is a landowning family that inherited, where wealth has been passed down through the generations. So she's probably inherited these attitudes from her background in particular. Moreover, she is cold and lacks affection. Notice the way she speaks to other characters, even her family members in the play. She never seems very emotional at all. She is a powerful and respected lady, quote, the most prominent member of the committee. So she's got a clear influence within her social circle and social sphere. She runs this charity committee. However, it's quite ironic that despite this, she's very disrespectful towards the inspector. Notice how she speaks to him and tries to stop his investigation. But equally, it's kind of ironic that she fails to intimidate him. So her power does not affect, and her influence do not affect the inspector. She is kind of like a husband, blind to an extent about the reality of what's going on in the play. She's in denial about her son's alcoholism. She refuses to acknowledge that, and goes so far to suggest that Eva Smith's husband, who at that point she didn't know was Eric, should be responsible for Eva Smith's pregnancy. But she's also shown to be hypocritical, because as soon as she realises it's Eric, she changes her mind. She's also shown to be very judgmental, and we see this because she's even judgmental towards Gerald, who comes from a similar aristocratic, well-off background, but she finds his affair with Eva, when it's revealed, she calls it disgusting. Like her husband, she's very stubborn and doesn't accept any responsibility for her part in Eva's death. So she's unchanged by the end of the play. Sheila. Sheila is an interesting character. When we first meet her, she's naive. So naive means she's quite sheltered, not really aware of what the world's like. She seems a bit immature. She's quite giggly and girlish in the opening scene. She's described as a pretty girl in her 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited, but also self-centered, and we see that when she talks about how she got Eva Smith fired purely because Sheila was having a bad day and was in a foul mood and decided to take it out on this shop assistant. However, despite this, she quickly shows compassion and empathy. She says these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So immediately she shows a contrasting attitude to Mr. Burling in that opening act. And she feels real guilt and remorse for her involvement in Eva Smith's death. And you notice throughout the play, Sheila speaks with a lot of emotive language, lots of exclamation marks. She genuinely is affected by this, and she has a conscience. She does have a moral, some sense of morals, and doesn't feels bad about what she did. Another aspect of Sheila's character, which is perhaps less obvious but still important, is that she's very perceptive. And this is interesting because unlike Mr. and Mrs. Burling, who you could say are quite blind to things, they don't see things very well or clearly, Sheila does. And she realises that Gerald knew Daisy from his first reaction. She's also the first to realise Eric's part in the story. She's the first to wonder who the inspector really is. She says to him wonderingly, "I don't understand about you." And near the end, she's the first to consider whether the inspector may be real or not. So she's a very perceptive, observant character. As the play progresses, she starts to demonstrate real maturity. So and this is seen. We first see this when Gerald reveals his involvement with Eva. He had an affair with her. This all happened between Sheila's back. But she's not angry with Gerald when she hears about the affair. And she says quite genuinely that she respects his honesty. And I think that shows real maturity and character. She also shows a degree of independence and I think courage in challenging her parents at the end of the play. She says, "It frightens me the way you talk." She's not afraid to speak her mind and be honest, even if it means going against the views of her parents. And most importantly, I think Sheila has developed by the end of the play. As an audience, we really do witness her growth and her sort of becoming this kind of much more mature and wise young adult. And she's got a new perspective on the world. And she has a real social conscience now. This part of her, which didn't exist before, has been awakened. And she's aware of her responsibilities as a person in society and in her community. So, now Eric. So Eric's a kind of a funny character. He's a bit odd. And from the beginning we see he's kind of awkward and shy. He's kind of on the edge of the scene. He kind of makes little comments here and there. He's described as in his early 20s, not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. We quickly learn he's a hardened drinker. Right in the opening scene, Sheila says, "Are you squiffy?" And he is, and probably is for a lot of the play. He is, however, very sympathetic towards Eva Smith and the working class. And when his father talks about how he thinks it's ridiculous that Eva Smith was asking for higher wages, Eric says, well, why shouldn't they try for higher wages? However, despite being sympathetic, Eric's also, at the same time, weak-willed, and he seemed to look for an easy way out of his troubles, which perhaps is why he turns to drink alcohol. Notice when he shows how he's weak-willed when he gets involved with Eva. He kind of gets drunk and makes a poor decision, and then he tries to kind of cover it up by, stealing money from his father. However, he feels guilt and frustration over his relationship with Eva. He says, "Oh my God, how stupid it all is." So he does have some kind of conscience, like his sister. What's really interesting about Eric is, unlike his family members, he seems to have an innate sense of responsibility. So innate means something you're born with, not something you've developed. So even from the beginning, he seems to take responsibility for his actions, which even Sheila at the beginning didn't. So although he got a woman pregnant, he was concerned enough to give her money. He was less worried about stealing from his father than he was about the girl's future. So by the end of the play, he, like Sheila, shows a real sense of social responsibility. He says, "We did her in all right." And like Sheila, he's appalled by his parents' inability to admit their responsibility. And he's quite harsh or honest in his criticism of his parents. He says, "I'm ashamed of you." When Mr. Burling tries to threaten him in Act 3, Eric becomes aggressive. He says, "I don't give a damn now." So he speaks out. He's not afraid to speak out towards his parents when it matters. Another character, Gerald. So Gerald is an interesting character because he's soon to be part of the family, but isn't yet. He's an aristocrat, so he comes from a similar type of family that Mrs. Burling comes from, which is probably why Mr. Burling says, "You're just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted." Mr. Burling knows that Gerald's parents, Lord and Lady Croft, have a great reputation and have a very good business, so they could be these. It's a great networking opportunity for Mr. Burling. So Gerald is this kind of secretive character. Even at the beginning, there's some hint that something was going on with him, because he talks about how he was busy at the works in the summer, and this is when Sheila kind of jokingly says, "Oh, I never saw you in the summer because you were always away at work or something." Also, he initially denies knowing Eva. He pretends at first he doesn't recognise the girl in the photograph. And I think this is part of what makes Gerald such a complex character. And while the Burlings, they all acted out of greed or anger, jealousy, spite, lust or pride in their interactions with Eva, you could say Gerald was motivated by sympathy and then genuine attraction. He says, "Because I was sorry for her." So you could say he's actually got quite good intentions, whereas all the others had their involvement with her was inspired by quite negative intentions. And he did look out for her and support her when she was very vulnerable and in a time of need. However, despite having this real sympathetic, kind side to his character, we see him at the beginning of the play agreeing with Mr. Burling that it was right to sack Eva Smith. So he seems to still hold on to these kind of upper-class prejudices. He doesn't think workers in a factory should challenge their boss or ask for more money. He disagrees with that. And like Mr. and Mrs. Burling, he focuses very much on protecting himself rather than changing his ways. And it's him in Act 3 who tries to come up with as much evidence as possible to prove that the inspector is a fake, mainly to get himself off the hook. And another thing that links him or makes him similar to Mr. and Mrs. Burling is, by the end of the play, he hasn't changed. And this is why Sheila is unsure whether to take back the engagement ring, because she's changed, she's developed, she's kind of had this new perspective, new awakening, and he hasn't. So that makes them quite different as characters. Finally, the inspector, who's an interesting character mainly because he plays such a crucial role in the play, but we learn so little about him. We do know, however, that he is got this strange power. He's a powerful character, and he's got a clear sense of authority. And remember that this is a play; it's on stage, and he's a character who will have real stage presence, and that's reflected in the way he's described in Priestley's stage directions. So Priestley introduces him by saying an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He's a man in his 50s dressed in a plain, darkish suit. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. And we see this authority and influence he has even in the lighting of the play, because Priestley writes the lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives, and then it should be brighter and harder. So the whole atmosphere changes when he arrives. So there's a sense that he almost controls the action in the play. He decides who speaks at what time. who's in the room, who's not in the room. He's a very calm and systematic character. You know, we don't really see him be very emotive or emotional until right at the end when he makes his very passionate speech. You know, he says one person and one line of inquiry at a time, otherwise there's muddle. And this is a real contrast to many of the Burlings who start reacting in all these very exaggerated ways. He's very calm, and you know, he follows a clear system, talking to one of them at a time. He seems to be omniscient, which is another word for all-knowing, which Sheila remarks on at one point in the play. He does seem to know everything, and even as an audience, we're kind of left to question and wonder how on earth he could know everything. You know, how does he know all this information about all of them? How does he know all this information about Eva Smith, and so on? Now, the inspector is a real contrast to Mr. Burling, and if you look carefully at the stage directions, you'll notice both characters are described as being characters with real presence. Mr. Burling's described as a large man, so he's kind of got this kind of threatening presence, whereas Mr. Gould's got this, it creates an impression of massiveness. However, while Mr. Burling represents one way of looking at the world, you could say he represents this kind of capitalist outlook, where he believes in focusing on the individual and individual success. You might say that Inspector Gould represents socialism or socialist ideas and believes in collective responsibility, not individual responsibility. So he's a direct contrast and opposite to Mr. Burling. And this is summed up in his final speech, which, if you are to talk about Inspector Gould or you're to talk about responsibility in the play, you must really address this speech, because there's so much in it. So he says, one Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. So notice how he uses the name Eva Smiths and John Smiths. They're very generic, sort of normal names to show that although Eva was one person, she represents, in a way, everyone, you know, or anyone could be her. He uses the word intertwined, so he doesn't think people live in isolation. He thinks everyone in a community and society are connected and should be connected. You know, he thinks we are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when, if man will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So note that really kind of violent choice of language and imagery in that last line, fire and blood and anguish. He's really speaking quite passionately about this. You know, this is what will happen if people don't learn to live with a sense of collective responsibility, feeling responsible for other people and not just yourself, and being part of a community. Finally, the inspector is he's mysterious, and this is, although there's an element of mystery around him throughout the play, it's really at the ending where he kind of disappears, and then we get the phone call, the Burlings get the phone call saying an inspector's calling. Just before that, Gerald calls up the police station and asks about an Inspector Gould, and they say, oh, no one with that name works here. Of course, Gould, Goole, it's the same pronunciation as Ghoul, Ghoul, which means ghost. So that's one way of looking at him. Is he a kind of ghost, a kind of supernatural figure? Some people might interpret him as being God or a representation of God. Some people say he represents the sort of conscience of the characters. So all those feelings of guilt and regret that they should feel, he kind of represents. So there are lots of different ways of interpreting his character, and what's important to remember is don't feel that you must stick with one of them, and actually it's much better to show the examiner that you can consider different possible ways of interpreting the inspector. So don't be afraid to say, you know, he is mysterious and he could be this, he could be that, and so on and so forth. What you then need to do is say, well, why might Priestley have made him so mysterious and difficult to interpret? Well, I mean, one answer is by making him so mysterious, there's shock value. You know, we're quite shocked as an audience at the end of the play, and perhaps that's what Priestley wants to do. He wants to shock us and sort of awaken in us a sense of responsibility. You know, he wants us to realise at the end of the play, you know, hold on, we need to perhaps reconsider how we live our lives. He doesn't want us to be a passive audience that just gets up, leaves the theatre, and goes on living a life like the Burlings. So maybe it's the shock value. He wants people to think really hard at the end of the play. Right, nearly at the end now. I'm just going to quickly give an overview of some of the key themes of the play. So remember, you might get a question about why different characters are important, or what different characters represent. And one way of answering that is you could talk about how the different characters show different themes within the play. Luckily, the themes are quite obvious, and we've been talking about all of them already. This is just a way of isolating them. So, one of the major themes is class. So Priestley obviously has a really strong social message in the play about class. He's really critical of a divided society which is bound by clear classes, so having a working class which is separate from, you know, the middle and upper classes. He's also really critical of the prejudice that upper class people often felt, you know, in 1912 towards working class people, and he believes very strongly in equality, and I think that message is reflected in, you know, the younger characters in the play as well as the inspector himself. One interesting thing to note is what working class people do feature in the play. I mean, really, the only working class character we see on stage is Edna, you know, the maid, who has a couple of lines and that's it. So notice how even in the play itself there's a lack of equality. You know, we don't get the side of a working class person. We get Eva Smith's perspective, we think, but only through other characters talking about her. You know, we don't actually meet her, obviously, because she's dead. You could argue that the inspector is a mouthpiece for Priestley, so when the inspector talks about class and so on, he's reflecting Priestley's ideas, so he's a way of Priestley speaking directly to the audience in the play. Another theme that's very much linked to class is this idea of responsibility. But what it comes down to is how we define and understand responsibility. Do we believe in individual responsibility, like Mr. Burling, with his kind of capitalist views, and a very kind of judgmental sense of responsibility, like Mrs. Burling? You know, in her charity position, she denies Eva Smith any help. So despite working for a charity, she doesn't feel responsible for someone like Eva Smith. On the other end, there's this idea of collective responsibility, which you might say is a socialist idea, which the inspector makes his speech about, and which Eric and Sheila seem to strongly feel and agree with at the end of the play. You know, they've really changed, well, certainly Sheila's changed her understanding of responsibility. And yes, that's what the inspector says at the end of the play: each of you helped to kill her. So he's got a very clear opinion on responsibility in the play. Finally, I think another important theme, perhaps not as important as the previous two, but still important, is age. So notice how the attitudes and the behaviours of the two generations in the play, the older and younger generation, are shown to be different. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Burling are very stuck in their ways of thinking. They're very stubborn, quite selfish. You know, they're not really receptive to new ideas or new perspectives, and they refuse to be honest with themselves. However, the younger generation, which is mainly represented by Sheila and her brother Eric, are much more honest, much more open, and have a much greater sense of compassion for other people, sense of collective responsibility, but also a willingness to change. So you might argue that Priestley's suggesting that the way forward, that the younger generation are the way forward. You know, we need people in 1945 like Sheila and like Eric, who have this strong sense of responsibility and social purpose. They're the ones who are going to help improve our society and make it a much more fair and equal society. Gerald's an interesting person to consider in terms of age, because although he's in Sheila's generation, he ultimately seems to side with the Burlings at the end of the play. You know, he wants to protect himself. He exposes the inspector as a fake or a fraud, and he doesn't seem to have changed his outlook or his ideas. So he seems to be stuck between two generations, two worlds, two ways of thinking.